G'day guys, John here. I'd like to chat to you today about testing ammo and procedure that can give you consistent results that'll allow you to move forward confidently buying whatever lot of ammo it is that you've come across as a good lot. All right, so to kind of start this conversation, I think we have to, and we all know this, but we have to talk about consistent fundamentals while actually testing. If you're not being a consistent shooter, your results on the paper downrange, they mean nothing really. And we got two examples of rifles here. This is across the board. And the main thing that we're looking at when testing our 22 LR ammo is the vertical dispersion. And so if you are inducing vertical dispersion, inconsistent cheek pressure, inconsistent bag pressure, and things like that, your grip pressure, if you're jerking the trigger, there's many things that can cause you to get some vertical in your groups. So you're going to want to be very consistent, and in a platform such as this here, we have the hand guard on the barrel nut. It is prone to having some vertical. Your plastic type stocks, this center section here is a fiberglass impregnated. There's some flex, and so they're very sensitive to cheek pressure, grip pressure, and things like that. So you're going to have to be very conscious of it while you're doing your testing. And then when we move over to the other end of the spectrum, where we have a full aluminum chassis, we do have some more forgiveness when it comes to some of those grip pressure, cheek pressure, etc. But we're still going to deal with the bag consistency, and generally when we're looking at a rifle like this, they are a fair bit more accurate, and so you're going to have to be a little bit more careful to decide between your different ammo as to which one is best. So you owe it to both systems to give it your best. Relax, do some warm-up, and then shoot for groups. Now a good way to practice this is shooting 50-yard groups till you're in the zone, because you're close enough that you're not going to be dealing with environmentals, and it's quick for you to see what's happening downrange. Alright, so at what distances do we want to test? I am of the opinion that around 200 yards is the ideal distance for testing ammo in your CRPS, PRS rimfire, and NRL 22X type competitions, because our majority of our distances are in that 150 to 220 range. So that is that like testing at 300s, it's not really going to matter. But what I have found with tracking data is testing at 50 yards means very little when it comes to the 200-yard groups. Mostly it means nothing. At 100 yards, you do have some indication, but it's not a guarantee what you're going to find at your 200 yards. And it would seem from 200 yards, it's going to give you a pretty good idea at 300 what is actually going to happen. I have many targets with this, so I've been looking at ways to, what's the least amount of groups that I can shoot and be confident that I have some kind of data that's going to mean something. And if you're shooting 20-shot groups, 2 groups, and you're looking at the SD, you're going to see if you have a random outline group with a flyer, so you had a bad bullet, you would then be able to retest. And what I have found, when you do that third group, the standard deviation is probably going to land right in with all of the other groups that you shot. Now, I have a little bit of data here that we're going to go over and discuss, showing some of those distances and how to interpret what you're seeing on the paper. Now, there's going to be a lot of guys who do not have the ability to test at 200 yards. Possibly the range they're part of only goes to 100, and that's okay. What you will do in that case is shoot at 100 yards, but only measure the vertical. Do not measure the group size like we normally would for extreme spread. We're only looking at the extreme spread of the vertical, and that does have it does have a relationship with what is happening at 200 yards, but it is still possible to have an ammo that is grouping very well in that 50 to 100 yard range, but doesn't hold out at 200 yards. So for instance, I had a lot of Lapua Center X, and at 50 yards, I seldom would see vertical spreads of over 0.3 of an inch. 0.4 would be an extreme case, and that was 10 shot groups. That ammo also shot very well at 100 yards, but at 200 yards I was seeing 8-inch vertical spreads, so it was not acceptable for our type of shooting. But what I have here is just selected a few different ammo that shoot well. I used this rifle, and you will see a correlation between the 100 and the 200 yard groups. So for my close range, my 50 and 100 yard group testing, I use targets like this, and you'll see these are my 50 yard 10 shot groups that I shot, long range, SK long range, SK rifle match. I got some contact here and some club, and I'm only looking at the vertical dispersion. My group sizes here are not extreme spreads of the bullet point of impact. And then I do the same at 100 yards, and it's same target, and I shoot the same 10 shot groups. At 50 and 100 yards, I feel that 10 shot groups are acceptable, and I like to have 2 groups, and then I feel I have safe data. You can shoot more, but if you're consistent and you have halfway decent environmentals, then it's going to work. Now at the 200 yards and 300 yards, I use an 11 by 17 paper that I print my own targets, but you can get a larger target. I feel it's very important that you shoot on paper. Shooting on steel is not good enough for a couple of reasons. One is you need a very distinct and fine aim point, so a splash of paint on a steel target, it's not cutting it. And the other thing is we want a very precise point of impact so that we can measure it out. Now there's 2 ways you can look at your data. You can look at the extreme spread of your group, and you can also look at the SD or the standard deviation from center. If you do not understand standard deviation and statistics like that, I highly recommend you look up the Precision Rifle blog. He has a blog in there that very well describes the different ways of looking at groups and what they mean to us as a shooter. So for instance here I have a group, it's with contact, and it's a 20 shot group. At 200 yards I do all 20 shot groups, same as 300, 400, 500. All of my data at those ranges is going to be 20 shot groups. And so in this case here I have an extreme spread of 3.25 inches and a standard deviation of 0.93. And what that means is, on average, my point of impact varies plus or minus 1 inch from center. Now that's only going to cover approximately 68% of my bullets. But if I take the standard deviation and I multiply it by 4, that is going to give me the 96% of all of my bullets are going to land within that plus minus 2 inches. So a 4-inch group should cover 96% of my impacts. When I have another group here, and this one here has an extreme spread of 4 inches, and the standard deviation is 0.95. So it's 0.02 of an inch bigger. So we would come up with essentially the same thing. 96% of my shots are going to land plus or minus 2 inches from my point of aim. I would feel that the standard deviation is a very important number to look at when you're comparing groups like this, because with our 22 ammo, there tends to be more flyers. And if I was strictly looking at the extreme spreads, in this case, the one group would be a 3/4 of an inch larger than the other, and could cause you to take and interpret that as the one being better than the other, when in reality the SD is identical for all intents and purposes. All right, we got a couple more targets here, and this is with Ely Force. Now the first one here, I have an extreme spread of 4.83 inches and a standard deviation of 1.28. We'll see at the bottom, we have 2 that hit significantly lower, I would say, but we have 3 that are lower and out of the group. If we move over here to the second target, I have an extreme spread of 4.38 inches and an SD of 1.17. And if we look at this group, we can see we have one that's kind of out of the bottom. The whole group is spread out a little bit more and more evenly dispersed. So if we compare the extreme spreads, we come up with 0.45 of an inch greater extreme spread. So we'll say half an inch roughly, just under. If we look at our standard deviation, it's 0.1 of an inch difference, 0.11. And if we multiply that by 4, so we have our 4 standard deviations for 96% of our shots, it's 0.44 of an inch. And our extreme spread difference was 0.45 of an inch. So they do track very well with each other, and the SD is accounting for the fact that these bullets here were out of the standard group and the standard deviation. So how does it track when we start looking at data and we lay out the extreme spreads and the standard deviations? So I have this here, I did it all in MOA so we can compare it across different distances. At 50 and 100 yards, Ely Contact gave me my best vertical MOA by a very small margin if I compare to the best in other ranges. But the interesting thing is Ely Force was my worst, and I have seen this many times over, where in the 50 to 100 yards, Ely Force for me does not shoot very well at all. But when I go to the longer ranges, it tends to shoot pretty good. But with the warmer weather, it has not shot as well. So this is something also to note. When you do testing in the winter or in the hot of summer, you're likely going to find a different velocity range that is perfect for you. But I kind of got off track there. So we'll go back to the group size. So Ely Contact is our best at 50, and it's also our best at 100 yards. The MOA is 0.67 at 50 and 0.77 at 100 yards. This is a 10-shot group, only measuring the vertical. Now when we move over to our 200 and 300 yard groups, our best at, if we're looking at extreme spreads, this is, our best at 200 is also the Contact at 1.72 MOA. And then when we look at the best SD, or standard deviation, in MOA. It is also the contact at 0.45. And that number is important to me because that tells me that the contact is the most consistent. So even if I have one flyer that's outside of that 96%, the vast majority of my bullets are very close to my point of aim. Now, when we look at the 300-yard groups, what we find out there is the extreme spreads was actually best with some SK long range. And up until this point, it actually did not look very promising. But then if we look at the standard deviations, we're back to the contact at 0.87. And interestingly, Ely Club came in with a standard deviation of 0.87 as well, even though the extreme spread was slightly bigger than the SK long range. Which brings up something that we also have to discuss when testing your ammo. If you're looking at your extreme spreads and you see a ½ inch difference or even a ¾ inch difference, but then you look at the standard deviation, you may very well find that statistically both of those ammo probably were going to shoot the same amount of points if you're shooting for score at 300 yards. So both numbers are important to consider. If you have an ammo that is shooting very, very tight groups, but then you're constantly getting an extreme flyer, you may want to not use that ammo simply because that flyer could cause you to make a bad wind call or think that you're shooting high or low. I think maybe a short explanation on standard deviation is called for here. If you're using Excel and you're into that kind of thing, it's very simple. But for you guys where it's not your kind of thing and you'd like a very basic way to figure this out for yourself, I'm going to try to explain that. So if you're shooting it on paper, when I shoot, 4 and 500 yards, I use a large steel plate. And so the way I can then calculate my extreme spreads and standard deviation is the very same way you can do it on paper for yourself. So what you do is measure from the bottom of your paper to the center of your impact. You do that for each of your impacts. Your extreme spread is the difference between your smallest and largest number. And your standard deviation, if you go into online, you Google it, you'll be able to find a standard deviation calculator. Enter all of those numbers, the distance from the bottom or the top to the center of each impact, and you'll come up with your standard deviation from center. It's very simple and it's quite easy for you to do yourself. All right, in conclusion, what ammo am I going to run? This here chart is just a few that I selected from amongst all the data I have. I have a lot more data than this, but I chose these simply to illustrate a point. And all of the data that I do have backs up this theory or this method of testing. So don't overthink it. Keep it simple, and it'll actually work out quite well. Which ammo am I going to use here? I'm going to shoot 4 or 5 of these. It means nothing to me. At 300 yards, the Ely Force in the summer does not do as well. In the winter, it does better. But so I might eliminate that one. If I'm shooting a 200, 250 yard match, I'll shoot any 4 of these. It doesn't matter to me. They're all going to shoot equally well. If I'm wanting to shoot 300 to 400 yards, in the summertime, I'm going to take the Force out. It's not going to be an option. But I still got 3 of these that I have no issue using. And the reason I say that is because when I look at the standard deviations, they're very, very close. Ely contact I have a standard deviation of 0.87 MOA at 300 yards, club 0.87, SK long range 0.9. That 0.03 times 4 is 0.12 MOA at 300 yards. It doesn't matter. That's not going to be an issue. So I'd be confident with any of these. When we look at the extreme spreads, we have an extreme spread of 0.5 roughly half an MOA difference. And that is where I find the extreme spread maybe isn't telling the whole story. But in this case here, Ely Club is consistently the best. So the 200 yard, it's the best. At 300 yard, it's in the best category. It's one of the best. And at 50 and 100 yards, it is also very consistent. So that is the ammo that I'm going to pick as my, shall we say, favorite. But I do not believe that in those three, it's going to actually make a difference in how many points that I accumulate at a match. Another thing that I would like to add into this conversation is don't get hung up on what groups your rifle shoots. Half of what you see on the internet isn't true and the other half is kind of sketchy. What really matters is how you shoot. You can have the best shooting rifle in the world, and off a bench you could be shooting sub MOA at 100 yards all day long. But you throw it into a position off of a barricade, kneeling, standing, off a tripod, you know, there's lots of different ways that we shoot in these competitions. If you are a 5 MOA shooter, it does not matter what your rifle is. Your rifle could be a 3 MOA gun and you wouldn't actually shoot any worse than if it was a 1 MOA gun. So remember, you have to do your part too. And if you want to run a little experiment to see this, take your Lapua Center X or whatever's shooting lights out for you at 50 yards and take some CCI standard velocity or one of your more bulk type ammos that doesn't shoot as well, and shoot groups at 50 yards, shoot prone, shoot kneeling, and standing off of a barricade. Try several different positions. Do each position with each ammo, and you see how much of a difference there really is. See if you can even tell which is the better ammo, especially if somebody would blind load your mags for you so you wouldn't be able to tell which ammo you're shooting for that particular group. And I think what you will find is it doesn't really matter. So until your skill level is better than what the ammo is that you're shooting, this conversation doesn't really matter. And you should be looking at yourself. But then as time progresses and you get better, the ammo is going to have a bearing on how you do at long range. I think that's all I got for you guys. I hope this helps somebody not worry about it as much and just take a simple approach to testing your ammo. Strongly consider what your standard deviation is for your groups. If you multiply your standard deviation by 4, that'll give you your theoretical extreme spread group size for 96% of your shots. And you should be good to go. All right, guys, we'll see you at the next match. Until then, stay focused.